Hello. Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. It's wonderful to see so many friends. I'm Heather Lamonides Brown, the Virginia N. and Randall J. Barbado Deputy Director and Chief Curator here at the CMA. 7 years ago, Dr. Ranajit K. Datta, in memory of Kiran P. and S.C. Datta Endowment Fund, was established at the CMA. Our friend Marjorie Williams, who recently retired as the Senior Leadership Giving Officer in our museum's philanthropy department, was instrumental in helping Dr. Datta establish the endowment in honor of his parents, and we thank you, Marjorie. The donor, the late Dr. Ranajit K. Datta, by profession was a materials scientist specializing in crystallography at East Cleveland's General Electric headquarters. But his passion was the Indian art collection at the Cleveland Museum of Art, which he came to know intimately during his nearly 3 decades as a docent and his even longer friendship with the CMA's former curator of Indian and Southeast Asian art, Dr. Stanislaw Chuma. Dr. Datta's other passion was his own collection of British silver, which, in order to create this endowment fund, he sold, except for one piece, which he gifted to the museum. That object, a stunning teapot made in colonial British India, will be on view for the first time in April in the exhibition that's upcoming. You may have noticed it on the screen, Raja Deen Dayal, King of Indian Photographers. And that exhibition is curated by our own Barbara Tannenbaum, Curator of Photography, in collaboration with Sonia Ray Mace, who I will mention in a moment. Ron, as he was known to his friends, established the endowment fund to ensure that the museum would always have the ability to invite leading scholars from around the world to speak about aspects of the collection and our exhibitions of Indian art, to add to our knowledge about the objects and to share new insights with you, the museum's public. And so far, thanks to the fund, the CMA has invited 2 scholars from India, 2 from Europe, and 2 from the United States. The speakers have all been leaders in aspects of Indian art that the museum showcases during the year of each talk. So far, we've focused upon Mughal paintings, medieval Buddhist sculpture, Indian pigment studies, art from the southern Silk Roads, and iconographical studies of the Hindu god Krishna. I will now turn the podium over to our Sonia Ray Mace, the George P. Bickford Curator of Indian and Southeast Asian Art at CMA, and Sonia will introduce this year's distinguished speaker, who we are so honored to host, Professor Phyllis Granoff, and she will speak today about medieval Indian manuscripts and the stories that they tell. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather, and good afternoon, everyone. It is with profound pleasure and gratitude that I introduce this year's Dr. Ranajit K. Datta Distinguished Lecturer in Indian Art, Phyllis Granoff, the Lex Hixon Professor Emerita of Religious Studies at Yale University. Phyllis began her career in the study of Asian languages as an undergraduate, first focusing on Japanese, studying abroad in Tokyo for 2 years, and then completing her BA degree at Radcliffe College in the Department of Far Eastern Languages, where she graduated summa cum laude, the first in her class, with an award for promise in the humanities. A mere 5 years later, she completed her Ph.D. with prizes and distinction at Harvard University in the dual departments of Fine Arts and Sanskrit and Indian Studies. Her advisor, John Rosenfield, would often say that Phyllis Granoff was the most brilliant graduate student he ever knew. And that is how I first learned of her as a legend. Her first book on a key work of the 12th century Hindu philosopher Sri Harsha was published in 1978 to reviews praising it as the first conceptually and textually responsible work dealing with Sri Harsha. This approach characterizes her work to this day, never basing her arguments on rote assumptions of previous writers or leaping to conclusions based on speculation, Phyllis accrued such a command of languages, ancient, medieval, and modern, including often ignored vernaculars from across South Asia, China, and Japan, that she bases her insights and conclusions on texts rarely read by any scholars. For this reason, her corpus of publications and translations are an ocean of revelation. Over the course of her illustrious career, first as professor of religious studies at McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario, from 1976 until 2004, her visiting professorships at Harvard University, University of California at Berkeley, and the École des Hautes Études in Paris, followed by her 16-year tenure as professor of world religions at Yale, Phyllis remained unfettered by the boundaries of historical academic categories. She has equal command over art and texts as associated with various branches of Buddhism, Hinduism, and Jainism from wide geographical expanses and time periods, leading her to recognize the complex interrelationships among them. She has also guest-curated exhibitions, notably victorious ones, Jain Images of Perfection, at the Rubin Museum, New York, in 2009. No other single scholar could have contributed so much to the understanding of the medieval South Asian manuscript collections at the Cleveland Museum of Art. Since 2014, she has been working on identifying the texts, down to the very excerpts found on loose, separated folios. Because of her work, we made exciting discoveries about the surprising range of texts represented in the collection. We now can understand how very aware the artists were of the texts on the pages they illuminated, and how the donors and teachers who made them and read them interacted with the manuscripts as sacred objects in various communities. The museum is entering a new era of presenting to the public greater contextualization of the works in the collection. To do so, curators must depend on collaborations with scholars in related fields. The current installation, Text and Image in Southern Asia, on view on the second floor in the Indian Painting and Himalayan galleries, has been mounted in honor of Phyllis Granoff's extraordinary generosity in sharing her time and unmatched skills, and as a small token of celebration of her recent retirement. Thanks to her contributions to the museum, and the efforts of our digital innovation and collections management staff, I am proud to announce that after years of work, the manuscripts have been correctly cataloged, digitized, and available open access and high resolution on the museum's website. And this summer, we'll have developed a book reader, so the pages of the manuscripts can be turned and paintings viewed in their proper place in relation to the text and images with which they were made. On a personal note, working with Phyllis Granoff on CMA's manuscript collection continues to be one of the most rewarding aspects of my work at the museum. So often, what starts as a simple question like, are we sure this is a Kalpasutra? Or isn't Rikaji a strange name for an artist? Leads to days or weeks of Phyllis's persistent searching and thinking until she finds the answer. My heart leaps whenever I see those emails with the subject line, bingo, because, as usual, Phyllis figured it out. And we learn what the text is, who wrote it, who rewrote it, who paid for it, and why it was important. And now I pass the podium over to my amazing mentor, colleague, and friend, Professor Phyllis Granoff, to tell us some of her ideas regarding medieval Indian manuscripts and the stories they tell. Please welcome Phyllis.
Thank you, Sonia, for that overwhelming introduction. The exhibit you're going to see brings together some of the rarest and most beautiful Jain and Buddhist manuscripts to have survived the many centuries since their creation. The Cleveland Museum stands out for the quality and the comprehensiveness of its South Asian manuscript collection. And I have really been uniquely privileged to work with its amazing curator of yours, Sonia Mace, over the years to study these manuscripts. I really don't know how to thank her for her kindness, generosity, and the inspiration that she has been to me. And so I agreed to come out of retirement and speak with you to share some of the many things she has taught me and I have learned by working with her. The objects in this extraordinary exhibit range in date from the 11th century to the 19th century, and they come from all over the subcontinent, from Gujarat and Rajasthan in the west, to Bihar and Nepal in the northeast, and the south, they come from Sri Lanka and from Southeast Asia, from Myanmar. The materials from which these manuscripts are made are equally diverse. The earliest examples in the exhibit are written on palm leaves at the top of the slide. Palm leaves were scarce and difficult to procure in many parts of the subcontinent, and paper, shown here in the middle, would soon supplant palm leaves as the main writing material, at least in the north, though this change met with considerable resistance. Manuscripts could also be made on specially prepared cotton, as the manuscript at the bottom was, and some donated in memory of a deceased layperson or monk or nun could even be made from the silk clothing of the deceased, the folios buffed with their cremation ashes. Not all manuscripts were illustrated. In fact, it seems that, at least initially, adorning a manuscript with paintings was the exception rather than the rule. It was not only revered canonical texts that were adorned. This Jain palm leaf folio in the exhibit is from the late 13th century, and it is really a collection of popular stories on everything: love and life, virtue and sin. The illustration depicts a senior monk, larger and seated on a throne, preaching to a junior monk, who is portrayed on a smaller and lower, less elaborate seat, indicating their respective positions in the monastic hierarchy. Beneath the monks are two lay men and women, perhaps the donors of our manuscript. The exhibit brings together manuscripts of two distinct religious traditions in the subcontinent, Jainism and Buddhism. Jainism is probably a generation older than Buddhism, and while the two religions differ considerably in doctrinal matters, they also have much in common. I show you here two images of a Jinnah and a Buddha, both here at the museum. The Jinnah is from Rajasthan and dates around 900 to 1000. It's bronze with silver inlay. The stone Buddha is from the other side of the country, from Bengal, and of a slightly earlier date. One of the many features Jainism and Buddhism share is that they both had a historical founder. Both were opposed to the animal sacrifice of the Hinduism of their day. And both preached nonviolence. They stressed the transient nature of worldly goods like wealth and status, but most importantly, of life itself. In addition, Buddhism and Jainism teach that this life we are living is one of only countless lives. We have had infinite rebirths in the past, and each rebirth entails loss and suffering. The goal of religious practice is to put an end to the cycle of rebirth, to end transmigration or samsara. This can only be done by renouncing the world. Buddhism and Jainism are both monastic religions. Both have orders of monks and nuns. They would come to differ in their monastic organization, with Buddhists having settled monastic establishments and Jains always alert to keep to an original ideal of wandering ascetics. They would also differ in the role of certain ascetic practices, with Jains advocating strict mortification of the body to a degree that Buddhists regarded as extreme. For Jains, severe fasting is an important way to get rid of karma and progress on the path to liberation. Such fasting was explicitly rejected by Buddhists. Indeed, the life story of the Buddha included an important episode in which the Buddha, still searching for the path to liberation, underwent a period of extreme fasting. He realized that this was not the correct way, and he propounded the middle path between a life of luxury and pleasure on the one hand and a life of total deprivation on the other. Images of the fasting Buddha were often made, particularly in the Northwest, and they often included the scene of breaking the fast, as does this 8th century example from Kashmir. You can see it in the Himalayan gallery. Monastic religions cannot survive without the generosity of a lay community, which provide the basics of food, shelter, clothing, and medicine for monks and nuns. The lay community also provided what the monks and nuns needed to sustain their rich devotional and intellectual lives. Indeed, in many areas of practice, Jainism and Buddhism became a world shared across the lay and monastic divide, with children of lay followers attending schools run by monks and nuns nuns accompanying lay pilgrimage parties to worship in the magnificent temples built by lay followers. The very monks who encouraged lay people to donate manuscripts encouraged them also to donate temples and images. The monks then performed the consecration rituals for the temples and images they donated. This photograph of a Jain temple in Calcutta, which you can see in the exhibit, shows the figure of a lay donor perpetually in worship in front of the temple that he financed and which monks would have consecrated. The manuscripts you see in the exhibit were thus part of a complex web of interactions between the monastic and lay communities. The manuscripts were tied by their donors to an urban culture and burgeoning economy of global trade networks on the one hand, and on the other, to networks of temples and pilgrimage sites, sometimes distant from urban centers, through the monks who were the intended recipients of the manuscripts and who instructed the donors both to have manuscripts copied and images donated. The exhibit includes several examples of the Kalpa Sutra, a Jain text that tells the lives of the Jinas and provides rules for the behavior of monastics during the rainy retreat, when monks and nuns were not allowed to continue their wandering because the risk of harming living beings was thought to be increased during the rains. The Kalpa Sutra was meant to be displayed as well as recited to an audience that included lay people at the end of the rainy retreat. Public preaching in both Buddhism and Jainism is another example of a shared space in which monastics and laity met and manuscripts played an important role. Here in this vibrant preaching scene, a wealthy family, adults and children, gather to listen to the Jain doctrine. There is much that we know about the circumstances under which these manuscripts were made, and much that we do not know, and that makes their study such a challenging and exciting event. What we know comes from the manuscripts themselves in their concluding comments or colophons. This Kalpa Sutra folio is the last folio of the manuscript, and it has a colophon. It tells us that the manuscript was made in 1335 Samvat, which corresponds to 1278 CE, and it was made at a major Jain center, Prahladanapura, the modern Palanpur in the state of Gujarat. This colophon tells us only the name of the city and the date when the manuscript was made, but many colophons are very detailed. They often give the name of the scribe who copied the manuscript, the monk or nun for whom it was made or at whose suggestion it was made, and the name of the lay donor. Genealogies are often provided for both the lay donors and monastics, and these manuscripts became an important vehicle for recording and preserving monastic and family histories. From the Colophons, we learn that some of the scribes were monks or nuns, and some were professional scribes who were paid for their work. Sometimes a particular manuscript was purchased for a monk, giving us a hint that there was actually a trade in books. Sometimes a second colophon was added, indicating that a manuscript had changed hands. Books were among the few possessions Jain monks were permitted to have, though their number was strictly limited. This limitation could cause some problems, and a medieval story tells us that one monk arrived in a town and was set to preach the next morning. He did not have the text he needed, so he stayed up all night and wrote another copy. The story indicates several things: that monks carried books with them, and that the written word was so important that a monk really had to have a book for preaching, even if he knew the contents well enough to write the book himself. In this painting, also in the exhibit, a Jain ascetic carries a book and a fly whisk under his arm. Both were essential. The fly whisk was to clear the path from insects so that none would be harmed as he stepped, and the book he needed for studying and preaching. So important was the presence of a book that preaching scenes in Jain manuscripts depict a book stand with a book on it directly in front of the preaching monk. The book may be even adorned with offerings. Books were equally important in Buddhism. Here is a 19th century Buddhist wall painting from Pagan. A senior monk is preaching, and he and the 3 junior monks who are listening all hold manuscripts. Colophons can also tell us why a lay donor donated a manuscript. Like the donation of an image, having a text copied may be for the welfare of a deceased member of the family, or even for the welfare of the donor himself. We learn, too, that the desire to have a manuscript copied frequently arose on hearing a monk preach. Sometimes a manuscript had a group of sponsors. In one case, hearing a monk preach, an extended family realized the truth of the Jain doctrine that everything in life is impermanent. They then had a manuscript copied for private reading and to be used in preaching. In another case, one of 4 brothers has died prematurely. A sibling stricken with grief found some comfort as he listened to a discourse by a Jain monk. He then commissioned a manuscript of a text on karma, on deeds and their consequences. The Colophon notes that the text was used 2 years later by a famous monk who preached from it. These statements that link the desire to donate a manuscript with hearing a monk preach may be reflected in the fact that so many of these early manuscripts contain illustrations of preaching scenes, together with lay donors. Here are 2 more examples that, to me, highlight the centrality of this reciprocal link between manuscript making and preaching. Hearing a monk preach leads a lay donor to finance the copying of a manuscript, and the manuscript in turn is then used by the monk to preach. We do not really know much about exactly where these manuscripts were made. One colophon on a Jain manuscript says that it was copied in the home of a lay donor, while a different one was copied in a communal ritual hall, and yet another was written in a library. Such libraries were often the private holdings of wealthy lay families who commissioned manuscripts for their collections or even bought existing manuscripts to enhance their collections. Specifics such as these about the exact place where a manuscript was made are not common. But from these sparse references, it would appear that manuscripts could be copied in many different places. There were no specifically designated scriptoria, as there came to be in medieval Europe. The history of where these manuscripts were preserved and who had control over them is extraordinarily complex. Given that there was no central authority, and Jain monastics were divided into distinct and often competing groups, it is not surprising that we discover that some manuscripts were held by various monastic groups, others by lay donors, and still others by prominent civic officials. They were often kept in inaccessible, dark chambers, and the process of bringing them together, preserving them, and cataloging them is really a 20th century phenomenon and is very much ongoing. Scribes were clearly focused on the accuracy of textual transmission. In Colophon after Colophon, they asked for forgiveness for any mistakes that they might have made, or deny indeed that a mistake was theirs. More than one defensive scribe wrote, "I have copied exactly what I saw. If there's a mistake, don't blame me." Other copyists were more humble. This is what the copyist of a manuscript from 1238 wrote. "Let noble readers correct whatever I have wrongly written, either because the example I copied from had a mistake, or because of my own confusion. It is true that those who copy texts often get confused." The focus on correct transmission of a text is, of course, common to both Jainism and Buddhism. A frequent refrain in Buddhist manuscripts from Thailand warns an ignorant reader not to make changes in the text and thereby introduce errors. But genuine scribal mistakes nonetheless abound, and Colophons tell us that the practice of copying a text involved an initial copy and then multiple layers of proofreading. Here are two folios of a Kalpa Sutra that is closely related to one in the exhibit. This one is from the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. I suspect that some of the corrections were made by readers. We see glosses explaining things marked by equal signs, but then there are all these X's indicating mistakes. In one case, a missing word has been supplied. Note the tiny sketches at the side of the folios indicating what is to be painted. The mistakes are not only in the text of the folios. At the bottom one, even the label provided is wrong and crossed out. This painting is also in the exhibit and shows the dreams of a king that foretell the arrival of the Jinnah. The dreams are in the little boxes at the top. It also contains a mistake, but one that is less obvious. You will see that the last two dreams are identical, showing figures worshiping the Jinnah. There really should have been only one of them. It was only one dream. What happened is that the painter forgot to illustrate the second dream, which is a wishing tree. And when he got to the end, in order to fill all the boxes, he just repeated the same dream twice. My all-time favorite of a mistake in a medieval manuscript is this page of a Bible made in France in the 13th century. At the top left, the painter has painted Mary carrying the baby Jesus on a donkey, as if it were the flight into Egypt. But it should be the entrance into Bethlehem before Jesus was born. Written in the margin are these frantic words: "Erase the baby whom the lady carries. She should not carry it here." We begin to understand why the makers of these manuscripts were so obsessed with making mistakes. The occasions for making them were so many. And when I discover them, it always makes me feel better. Colophons also rarely indicate that making a manuscript could indeed be a very costly undertaking. I know of only one case, but undoubtedly there are more. A Jain laywoman donated a manuscript in 1401 CE. She didn't donate it to a monk, but had it placed in the library. The colophon ends with a prayer that the flawless book remain as long as the sun and moon shall shine, as a resting house for travelers on the path to liberation. The mention of expense gives us, I think, a clue as to how a contemporary audience might have appraised these manuscripts. Medieval stories suggest that it was the costliness of the materials employed to make a manuscript that made it beautiful, rather than the illustrations. Numerous stories are told of a king Kumarapala who reigned in Gujarat in the 12th century. He is said to have been converted to Jainism by the monk Hemachandra. Hemachandra was one of the most gifted and prolific of all medieval Jain monks. This exhibit includes a palm leaf manuscript of his Yoga Shastra, a comprehensive text about Jain beliefs and practices. Another here in the museum is a complex poem written by Hemachandra. It retells the glorious exploits of the king and his ancestors, while at the same time illustrating principles of grammar. It is not an easy read, I assure you. Remarkably, an inscription, now barely legible, tells us that this is the king Kumarapala listening to a discourse by the monk Hemachandra. King Kumarapala was such an important figure to the Jains that he soon became the subject of countless legends. One of them describes a manuscript he had made of a text composed by by Hemachandra. It was written in letters of gold and silver, and we have no idea of what it might have looked like. None of King Kumarapala's manuscripts is extant. But this exquisite Kalpa Sutra you can see in the exhibit has lettering in gold for the text and in silver for the figures on the sides. And other examples of Jain texts written with gold letters are known. Nor was writing sacred texts in gold or in silver confined to South Asia. This is a Buddhist manuscript from 12th century Japan here in the museum. The lines of text alternate in gold and silver. Kumarapala's manuscripts were said to have been treated with great reverence and worshipped with gifts of gold, jewel, and precious cloth. Like the Jain stories about Kumarapala's manuscript with its gold and silver letters, Buddhist chronicles of kings similarly describe royal donations of Buddhist sacred texts made of costly materials. These manuscripts might have eclipsed even those of King Kumarapala, for they were not on palm leaves with golden letters, but entirely on sheets of gold. The two royal chronicles of Sri Lanka name several kings who had Buddhist texts incised on gold plates, some of which were even decorated with precious stones. We know that such gold texts were actually made at the time these chronicles were compiled. Here is a 5th century Buddhist text discovered from Myanmar. As you can imagine, texts incised on gold, or even with letters of gold and silver, were the exception. This gold Buddhist text is also a treasure for its early date. The only earlier surviving Buddhist manuscripts were written on birch bark and come from the Northwest. Some date as early as the 1st or 2nd century, but they are truly unusual. Manuscripts on palm leaves do not survive from such an early date and are still earlier than paper manuscripts. Our exhibit includes Buddhist manuscripts, a Buddhist palm leaf manuscript from the 11th to 12th century. Manuscripts like these Buddhist manuscripts were often kept in monasteries, which may even have had a separate area set aside for their storage. Sometimes they were kept in temples or even housed in special libraries built to contain them. This is one library in Bagan built in the 18th century. The manuscripts were often stored in special chests that were themselves richly adorned, often with gold. Some of them depicted scenes from the life of the Buddha. This is an example, again, from a temple in Myanmar. At the time of their donation, Burmese Buddhist manuscripts were often lovingly bound with cotton or silk straps woven by women. These straps, like colophons to the manuscripts themselves, recorded the names and pious aspirations of their donor. Unfortunately, even these costly sutra cases and painstakingly woven protective straps were no guarantee that manuscripts would be carefully preserved. Scattered around the sutra case I showed you were many torn and damaged folios. Manuscripts could also be buried in Buddhist stupas, which were constructed to enshrine the relics of the Buddha and famous monastics. The words of the Buddha inscribed on a manuscript are also his relic, his continuing sacred presence. This is the great Shwedagon Stupa in Myanmar from a photograph in the exhibit. As in the stories of the Jain king Kumarapala, Buddhist kings are also said to have instituted festivals to celebrate and worship the manuscripts they had made. While donatory inscriptions and stories of royal donations focus on gold, silver, and gems, we would be wrong to assume that only such lavish donations were valued. Medieval Jain and Buddhist stories repeatedly praise the humble gifts of the poor and emphasize that the merit gained from a donation has nothing to do with its monetary value. One of the most famous of all humble donation stories is Buddhist. In a previous birth, the future Emperor Ashoka gave the Buddha a gift of dirt, having no food to offer him. As a result of that gift, he was reborn to become a world emperor. Most of the manuscripts, Jain and Buddhist, that have survived were really modest productions. If Colophons tell us the who, why, when, and where of a manuscript, and royal chronicles praise the costliness of the materials of a manuscript, we are still left to wonder what importance might have been accorded the beauty of the illustrations and calligraphy. I think looking at this extraordinary book cover that comes from this museum, and this folio of the Buddhist Gandavyuha Sutra on view now in the Himalayan Gallery, we have no doubt that the makers of these manuscripts found beauty in the natural world, the human form, and the works of human hands. Reading Jain and Buddhist texts of different genres, we find examples of a profound awareness of the beauty of the world, man-made and natural. Special emphasis is given to the unparalleled beauty of the persons of their founder. I'd like to take us back to the Jain Kalpa Sutra. This folio from a Kalpa Sutra dated around 1475 is in the exhibit. It depicts the unusual conception of the Jiva Mahavira, who in one Jain tradition was first conceived in the womb of a Brahmin woman and transferred as an embryo to the queen who would become his mother. Jains reject the traditional hierarchy with Brahmins at the top. Here we see a goat-headed deity responsible for both miscarriage and safe birth in popular belief, take the embryo of the Brahmin woman and bring it to the queen. He will give her fetus to the Brahmin woman. The complex treatment of the different fabrics is almost dizzying. The blouses and lower garments of the two women are minutely patterned, as are their scarves with differently painted borders. Cushions and pillows are of different color and design. Together, these fabrics create an elaborate array of color, line, and shape. The next image is the birth of a jinna from a Kalpa Sutra in the Welcome collection in London. Note the beautiful skirt that the new mother wears with its pattern of swans. One explanation for the detailed reproduction of textile patterns in these and other Kalpa Sutra manuscripts is that many members of the Jain lay community who were the patrons of these manuscripts were involved in the textile trade. While this is no doubt true, it still would not explain a similar fascination with the visual, olfactory, and tactile qualities of the queen's bedroom in the much earlier sutra itself. Her room is filled with color. The walls are painted with murals, and freshly cut flowers of 5 different colors are everywhere. Colored light emanates from precious stones embedded in the floor. Many different kinds of rare incense perfume the chamber. So dense is the smoke that the room seems transformed into a veritable stick of incense. The description of the queen's bedchamber reaches a crescendo with the bed itself, and here I've abbreviated but quote from the translation of Mukundala. The bed had a downy mattress with pillow cushions on both ends. It was raised at its 2 ends and was pronouncedly concave in the middle. It was soft and pliant like the sands of the Ganges. The bed was laid out with sheets of silk, which were cool like water, and over them was spread an exquisitely designed dust-protecting cover. It was canopied with a beautiful red netting. It was soft to the touch, like fur, like the softest cotton, like newly churned butter, and the softest plant filaments. On it was sprinkled a powdered extract made from fragrant flowers. It lacked nothing that was needed for pleasant sleep. This bed, like the room itself, has everything at once: color, fragrance, soft touch. Multiple similes make sure that we can feel the softness of the bed. The fabrics in the illustrations no doubt reflect contemporary textile patterns, but the awareness of their elegance belongs to the much earlier sutra itself. Indeed, to an audience familiar with the text, the touch and fragrance of the sumptuous bedding would have been easily felt as the eye delighted in the textile patterns in the illustrations. The passage describing the queen's bedchamber is not an isolated occurrence in the text extolling the beauty of an object. Mahavira's father, as befits a king, rises with the sun. Here is how the text describes the sunrise, using the same technique of piling simile upon simile to highlight its splendor. Next day, early at dawn, with the light yet pale, when tender lotuses had opened their petals, the sun shone red. Its color could be compared with a red ashoka flower, or the beak of a parrot, or the eyes and feet of a pigeon, or the eyes of a cuckoo, or a bunch of china roses, or a heap of cinnabar. The sun rose slowly, dispelling the darkness with his rays, and filled the world with turmeric-hued sunshine. This unusual illustration from another Kalpa Sutra in the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, uses gold to emphasize the glow of the sun as it rises above the mountain. Gold streaks across the mountain, and even the trees are set aglow. The sky is still dark, but the ruddiness of dawn can be seen in the rocks. The manuscript is not dated, but has been assigned to the 16th century. If not the sole manuscript to illustrate the sunrise, it surely is one of very few. Text and image leave no doubt that the beauty of the sunrise was an object of wonder for the compilers of the text, the painters, and their audience. It was not only the beauty of the natural world and man-made objects that Jain texts celebrate. The physical beauty of the Jinnah himself is also a consistent theme in the literature. A sutra describes Mahavira this way. Mahavira has the most excellent skin color. His most excellent, perfectly healthy, incomparable flesh is stark white. His body is radiant, and his hair is dark black. The text gives a list of black things with which his hair shares the same color. They include lampblack, a bee, a black gemstone. Mahavira's scalp is red like a dalima flower, like gold. His forehead is like the crescent moon, and his face like the full moon. His eyebrows are black, and the white part of his eyes is like a full-blown lotus. His lips are pink, like polished coral, or like a bimba fruit, and his teeth are white, like, among other things, the crescent moon, a conch, and this is my favorite, the froth of fresh cow's milk, jasmine. In this image, the baby Jinnah sits in the lap of the god Indra. The two are indistinguishable in skin color, and we can see the black hair, black eyebrows, and soft pink lips of the Jinnah. This folio is from a 14th century Kalpa Sutra in the Metropolitan Museum. Some monks would wonder, why is there all this emphasis on the physical beauty of the Jinnah? Where does his beauty come from, they asked, and why does it matter? Here is the answer to those questions from a 12th century commentary that was made to this brief remark. And here's the brief remark. Beauty comes from the merit of practicing the Dharma. Even those who are good-looking practice the Dharma. A handsome person is listened to, and so we praise the beauty of the Jinnah. The commentator explains that when people hear that physical beauty is the result of practicing the Jain religion, they also want to become pious Jains. He adds that a handsome person is more likely to command attention and be listened to than an unattractive person. The extreme beauty of the Jinnah also humbles the pride of spectators who are impressed with their own good looks. Turning to Buddhist texts, like their Jain counterparts, Buddhists also elaborately praise the physical beauty of the Buddha. They took delight in the man-made luxuries of their time, and moreover described a world of incomparable beauty that is our world transfigured by the Buddha's presence. This exhibit includes an incredibly rare palm leaf manuscript of Buddhist protective rituals, dated 1117. The deities who embody the spells are as gorgeously attired as figures in the Jain manuscripts. Their garments are depicted in painstaking detail. The spell queens and kings are adorned with crowns meticulously painted, and they are festooned with jewelry, earrings, necklaces, arm bracelets, all lovingly depicted. Note the attention given to the architecture and the lush foliage behind the temples. Somewhat fierce with their weapons and their many arms, these figures are given a courtly grace and beauty. Set in gold temples, they themselves seem to glow, the careful shading of the limbs highlighting a luminous and numinous presence. This golden radiance is exuberantly celebrated in Buddhist texts. In numerous texts, the adjectives and similes that refer to the Buddha highlight his golden body color. They often denote light and emphasize his radiance. The small golden Buddha from Myanmar in this exhibit reflects the Buddhist emphasis on this golden radiance of the Buddha. Even while in the womb, the Buddha illuminates the chamber in which his mother is resting. He makes her entire body glow. His light makes radiant the entire palace. And outside the palace, every direction is aglow from his splendor, his light, his radiant color. This is an extraordinary painting from Myanmar that dates to 1090 CE. The Buddha is in his mother's womb, and he has turned her body gold, and everywhere around her is alive with a golden glow. The newborn Buddha is said to be radiant like a gold coin, made of the purest gold, and polished by a goldsmith of the greatest skill. And that radiance will leave the Buddha only on 2 occasions, when he is undergoing the terrible fast that he ultimately rejects, and when he is about to die. At all the other times, the Buddha is a glowing, radiant presence, as in this very early stone sculpture that you can see in the museum, where the Buddha is present as a fiery pillar. We often hear how the radiant presence of the Buddha can transform our world. With a mere touch of his foot, he turns our world into a paradise of glittering, gleaming gems. Perhaps that is one reason why donors chose to embellish their texts with gold and have them written on gold leaf, and to apply gold leaf to their stupas and images. It is a way to show us how our own world can be transmuted into a transcendent radiance by the presence of the Buddha and through the alchemy of faith. As the Buddha and the Jinnah went on to form their respective religious communities, it is often the very sight of them that creates in the audience a desire to renounce the world and follow their teachings. Those who see the Buddha or the Jinnah only long to see him more. They are never satisfied by one glance. I suspect that is true for all of us as we look at the objects in this exhibit. One look is never going to be enough. And so once more, I want to thank Sonia for inviting me to come, to see them again, and have the opportunity to share with you my own sense of wonder on seeing them. Thank you. I would be happy to try to answer questions that you might have.
I have a question about the divinity and in the text and the calligraphy associated with it. Is that dependent strictly on the scribe, or is there a trend in terms of the divinity as there is with kanji in Japan?
So the calligraphy is pretty much standardized. And if you look at a number of manuscripts of the Kalpa Sutra, for example, you will see that there is an ornate script that is used there. On other manuscripts, however, the handwriting can vary considerably depending on the skill of the writer and the place where the manuscript has been copied.
What about manuscripts from other traditions that existed around the time, like
So I think your question is how these manuscripts compare with manuscripts from other religious traditions in medieval India. It's a wonderful subject. There are many studies done on some of the very earliest manuscripts of Vaishnava poetry, and the scholars have drawn attention to the very close relationship between those texts and these Jain manuscripts. And there is very definitely an ongoing conversation between all of these religious traditions in their written texts and in their painting. It's also the case, we don't know a lot about the painters, but it may very well be the case that the painters of many of our manuscripts also painted non-Jain manuscripts and may not themselves have been Jain. That's a question that we really need to do more work on, and it's not entirely clear to me how far we can go with it given the evidence that exists.
Talk about a little bit more. That is, why did it take so long, do you think, for paper to be used and introduced with the making of Kama Sutra? Is it the timing around the 15th century?
Right.
One palm leaf manuscript dated all the way up to 1428. And just about 20 years after that, paper comes in and they don't really go back to using palm leaf anymore.
So, of course, palm leaf manuscripts stay in the south. Palm leaf continues to be used in Tamil Nadu and in southern areas and in Sri Lanka, where the particular palm tree grows that yields leaves that are suitable for writing on. But in the north of India, paper replaces palm leaf. There's a wonderful story. Again, it's about King Kumarapala. And he wants to have these texts copied, the texts of his preceptor, Hemachandra. And he's presented with a bunch of paper folios with text on it, and he's absolutely horrified. And the minister explains to him that palm leaves are not available and paper is the next best thing. So he undertakes a fast, goes out, and prays to the guardian of the faith, and the right palm trees suddenly appear, and he can then put his manuscripts on palm leaves. It was considered an inferior material and unsuitable for sacred text. But in practical terms, they really had very little choice, and paper is so convenient to use that it finally takes over in North India, where there really isn't the proper tree.
I have a brief question about institutions who have these palm leaves today. What are the conservation versus preservation techniques that are kind of in place to preserve these palms?
So there are now extensive efforts to catalog and preserve manuscripts of all sorts in India. There's at the national level, and then by various local institutions and private institutions. For Jain manuscripts, there are major efforts at cataloging them, and there's one particular institution outside of Ahmedabad that is actively engaged in collecting, cataloging, and preserving the manuscripts. So at every level in India at this point, there's an awareness of the importance of preserving these manuscripts.
My question has to do with the manuscripts, the use of the manuscripts themselves. And you referred to that when he recopied the manuscript or he rewrote it. We've been in Nepal and witnessed it's very important to have those manuscripts in front of you, even though they clearly know the text. So could you expand on that a little bit?
Well, it's interesting because it's one of the things that fascinated me, because we're often taught, or at least I was taught, I'm old, and we were taught old things that are no longer in vogue, but we were taught that India was an oral culture. And so it surprised me when I first began to read these stories about how central the written word was and the importance of books. So I needed to revise my own thinking about orality versus the written culture. There's no question that this is very much a written culture. and that books and literacy are very important. We get in Buddhist stories of a fairly early date accounts of women who are sitting around by candlelight and they're reading. So I think initially in the early encounters with Indian culture, we undervalued the importance of literacy and the role that literacy and written documents played in the culture.
I should have asked when I was up there, is it a pathway to spirituality to use those, or is that not correct?
So it's definitely a meritorious act to copy to have a manuscript copied. And of course, if you, in this kind of climate, if you don't keep copying texts, they're going to disappear. So it's a very important part of preserving the religious tradition and preserving these texts. So I think one way you can look on the constant praising of copying of manuscripts is that this was a vital part of preserving the religious tradition.
Could I ask one? Do we have time for me to ask one? Okay. Well, I'll make it two very short ones then. The first, which is my curiosity getting the better of me, one of the manuscripts you showed without showing the location had little rabbits everywhere. And I was wondering if there was a special significance to them. And then the other question I have is like thinking about the conservation question. One of the things I was learning about Buddhist painting versus statuary in the medieval Japan context was that at the time of a major ritual, it was quite common to commission a new painting to replace the one that had been used previously. But sculpture, on the other hand, should not be preserved. Well, not be have a new one made for the ritual, but to continue to use the same one. And that was an interesting difference about the idea of conservation to me. So I wonder about that. Do we hear about commissioning of already owned texts, a new version for a new ritual or a new edition?
I'm not sure that I heard the question completely.
Oh, I'm sorry. To put in song, was it common for a monastery or palace somewhere that had a library of sutra or manuscript to commission another copy of one that was already in hand on the occasion of a special ritual?
So I think the answer is yes. I think there was no limit on the number of manuscripts, but that of a given text that would be copied. The monastery itself is not commissioning them so much as individual lay donors, often at the suggestion of a monk, are making the decision to have a manuscript copied. And I'm sure that in every case, these are manuscripts of texts that exist in multiple copies and are available in multiple copies. It is nonetheless a pious and meritorious act to have a manuscript of that text copied.
I'd like to ask you a question. I could speak louder. As a childhood, I always remember the great monks from China went to Japan. Is these documents you show on the Japanese, the Holy Script, are they the monks brought from China to
Right, thank you very
I'll
much.
repeat the question for the circuit recording. Thank you, Anthony. So he was asking about how he has heard that so many texts went from China to Japan and even moved from India to China. So were any of these manuscripts that we were looking at today, were they part of that transmission of Buddhism?
So the Japanese manuscript, no doubt, the one I showed you with the gold and silver leaves, is part of that transmission from India to China to Japan. And of course, that particular manuscript happens to be a Chinese translation of a Sanskrit text. So it's definitely in that. In terms of the Buddhist manuscript that we saw, the Gandavyuha and the protective text, I would be less inclined to say that they're coming through China. The protective text is it's not the same, I would think, as the particular text written in Chinese that I showed.
But I think the paper was invented in China, and on the paper, it was taught by the Buddhist monk from China to India.
I think a lot of scholars today would argue that paper was brought by Arab traders and comes into India at a relatively early date with the Arab traders.
Okay, Phyllis.
Thank you.
Perfect. Yes, thank you so much, Phyllis, for a stunning presentation, and to all of you for your fabulous questions. So I hope you see the works on view upstairs in a new light and in greater depth. And I also want to call out a big thanks to Andrew Capetta and to Jeff Judge and Cameron McConnell, who organized the lecture this year and deftly handled the recording. So those of us who want to hear the talk again will be able to do so. So finally, we look forward to seeing you at all the many upcoming South Asian lectures and exhibitions happening this year. The next Datta lecture, we're moving to the end of the summer. So those, our friends in India, including the Datta family, will be able to come. Our next lecture, Datta Distinguished Lecture in Indian Art, will be on Saturday, August 26th with Dr. Deborah Diamond, the curator of the summer's exhibition, A Splendid Land. So hope to see you all again soon. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you for being here.